In the scorching heat of the Arizona desert, where secrets lie buried beneath shifting sands, a weathered cowboy named Jake Morrison thought he knew the difference between right and wrong. But when he stumbles upon evidence that could destroy everything he believed about justice, he must confront a truth so devastating it threatens to shatter his very soul. This is a story of betrayal, redemption, and the courage to face the darkness that lurks beneath badges of honor. The sun was merciless that October morning as Jake Morrison rode his horse, Thunder, across the vast expanse of the Sonoran Desert. At 52, Jake had spent most of his life working cattle ranches, his weathered hands and sun-beaten face telling stories of countless days under the unforgiving Arizona sky. He wasn't looking for trouble when he decided to check on the old water well near Skeleton Ridge. He was simply doing what any responsible rancher would do during the drought season. The well had been abandoned for over 20 years, ever since the county had installed newer pumping systems closer to town. But Jake remembered his grandfather telling him stories about this place, how it had once been a lifeline for travelers crossing the desert. As he dismounted Thunder and walked toward the crumbling stone structure, something glinted in the morning light, catching his attention. Partially buried in the sandy soil near the well's base was a tarnished metal object. Jake knelt down and carefully brushed away the sand, revealing what appeared to be an old sheriff's badge. The metal was corroded, but he could still make out the words "Dusty Creek Sheriff" etched into its surface. Jake's heart skipped a beat. Dusty Creek had been his hometown, and this badge belonged to a time he thought he'd left far behind. As he held the badge in his weathered palm, memories came flooding back. 23 years ago, Jake had been a deputy in Dusty Creek, working under Sheriff Thomas Brennan, a man he had idolized and trusted completely. Sheriff Brennan had been like a father to Jake, teaching him about justice, honor, and the sacred duty of protecting the innocent. But Jake had left law enforcement abruptly, moving to ranch work without ever looking back, telling people only that he'd lost faith in the system. The discovery of the badge stirred something deep within Jake's chest, a mixture of nostalgia and unease that he couldn't quite shake. He pocketed the badge and was about to mount Thunder when he noticed something else. The ground around the well showed signs of recent disturbance. Someone had been digging here, and recently. The thought sent a chill down his spine despite the desert heat. Jake spent the next hour carefully examining the area around the well. What he found made his blood run cold. Partially exposed in the sandy soil were fragments of what appeared to be human remains, old bones that had been buried deep but were now being unearthed by the desert winds and recent flash floods that had swept through the region. His hands trembling, Jake used a stick to carefully expose more of the remains. Along with the bones, he found remnants of clothing, a leather wallet, and most disturbing of all, what appeared to be handcuffs, the old-style steel cuffs that the sheriff's department had used back in his day. The wallet, though deteriorated, still contained fragments of identification that made Jake's heart stop. The name, Miguel Santos, was still partially visible on what remained of a driver's license. Miguel Santos. Jake remembered that name all too well. 23 years ago, Miguel had been a key witness in a corruption case that had rocked Dusty Creek. He had been scheduled to testify against several prominent businessmen who had been bribing local officials, but Miguel had disappeared just days before the trial. The case had collapsed without his testimony, and the corruption charges had been dropped. Sheriff Brennan had led the investigation into Miguel's disappearance, concluding that the man had simply fled town to avoid testifying. But now, staring at Miguel's remains beside an abandoned well, Jake began to realize that the truth might be far more sinister than anyone had imagined. The handcuffs suggested that Miguel hadn't fled. He had been murdered, and quite possibly by someone in law enforcement. The discovery shook Jake to his core, forcing him to confront the possibility that everything he had believed about justice, about Sheriff Brennan, and about his own past might have been built on lies. The drive back to Jake's ranch felt like the longest 30 miles of his life. The sheriff's badge seemed to burn in his pocket, and the image of Miguel Santos remains haunted his thoughts. Jake had always prided himself on his ability to read people, but the possibility that he had been so completely deceived by someone he trusted made him question everything he thought he knew about human nature. Back at his modest ranch house, Jake sat at his kitchen table and carefully examined the corroded badge under a magnifying glass. The wear patterns and scratches told a story of years of use, but what caught his attention was a small inscription on the back that he hadn't noticed before. TB, 1985 to 2001. Thomas Brennan had served as sheriff for exactly those years, which meant this badge had belonged to his mentor and father figure. Jake's mind raced as he tried to piece together the timeline. Miguel Santos had disappeared in November 2001, just a month before Sheriff Brennan had announced his retirement. Brennan had always claimed he was leaving law enforcement to spend more time with his family, but now Jake wondered if there had been other reasons. The timing was too coincidental to ignore. Unable to shake his growing suspicions, Jake decided to visit Sarah Chun, the current sheriff of Dusty Creek. Sarah had been a rookie deputy when Jake was still on the force, and she was one of the few people from his law enforcement days that he still trusted. More importantly, she had access to the old case files that might help him understand what had really happened to Miguel Santos. The drive to Dusty Creek took Jake through familiar territory that he hadn't visited in years. The small desert town had grown considerably since he'd left, with new subdivisions sprawling outward from the original Main Street. But the sheriff's office remained in the same squat adobe building where Jake had once worked, its walls holding memories, both cherished and now tainted by doubt. Sarah greeted Jake with surprise and genuine warmth. At 45, she had aged gracefully, her black hair now streaked with silver, but her eyes still held the same sharp intelligence that had impressed Jake when she was just starting out. She led him to her office, noting the troubled expression on his weathered face. Jake placed the sheriff's badge on Sarah's desk and watched as recognition dawned in her eyes. He then told her about discovering Miguel Santos' remains, leaving out no detail of what he had found at the abandoned well. Sarah listened in stunned silence, occasionally picking up the badge to examine it more closely. When Jake finished his account, Sarah leaned back in her chair and ran her hands through her hair. She had always respected Jake's integrity, and she knew he wouldn't fabricate such a serious accusation. But the implications of what he was suggesting were staggering. Sheriff Brennan had been a pillar of the community, a man respected by everyone who knew him. Sarah pulled out the old case files related to Miguel Santos' disappearance, spreading them across her desk. As they reviewed the documents together, several disturbing patterns began to emerge. The investigation into Miguel's disappearance had been unusually brief, with Sheriff Brennan concluding that the man had fled voluntarily after only a few days of searching. No federal authorities had been contacted despite the fact that Miguel was a key witness in a corruption case. Most troubling of all, the last person known to have seen Miguel alive was Sheriff Brennan himself, who had interviewed the witness at the sheriff's office on the evening of November 15th, 2001. Jake felt his stomach churn as he read Brennan's report of that final interview. According to the sheriff, Miguel had seemed nervous and had mentioned receiving threats related to his planned testimony. Brennan had offered to provide protection, but Miguel had allegedly declined and left the office around 9 p.m. That was the last official sighting of Miguel Santos. But now, knowing where Miguel's body had been found, Jake began to see the holes in Brennan's story. The abandoned well was located on county property that would have been easily accessible to the sheriff without raising suspicion. The handcuffs found with the remains suggested that Miguel had been restrained, contradicting any theory that he had left voluntarily. As the weight of evidence mounted, Jake felt his world crumbling around him. The man who had taught him about honor and justice, who had been like a father to him, appeared to be a murderer who had killed a witness to protect corruption in their small town. The realization was devastating, but it also explained something that had puzzled Jake for years: why he had lost his passion for law enforcement so suddenly and completely. Deep down, Jake realized he had always suspected that something wasn't right about Miguel's disappearance. His subconscious had picked up on inconsistencies and warning signs that his conscious mind had refused to acknowledge. His abrupt departure from the sheriff's department hadn't been just about disillusionment with the system. It had been his psyche's way of protecting him from a truth too terrible to face. 3 days after his meeting with Sarah, Jake received an unexpected visitor at his ranch. A black sedan pulled up his dusty driveway just after sunset, and from behind his kitchen window, Jake watched as a tall, well-dressed man in his 60s emerged from the vehicle. Even after 23 years, Jake recognized the distinctive silver hair and commanding presence of Thomas Brennan. The former sheriff approached Jake's front door with the same confident stride that had once inspired respect and admiration in his young deputy. But now, knowing what he knew, Jake saw something different in Brennan. Bearing a calculated wariness that suggested this was no casual social call. Jake opened the door before Brennan could knock, studying the face of the man who had once been his hero. Time had been kind to the former sheriff. He remained fit and imposing despite being in his 70s, his pale blue eyes still sharp and assessing. But there was something cold in those eyes now that Jake had never noticed before, or perhaps had never allowed himself to see. "Hello, Jake," Brennan said, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone that had once commanded Jake's instant obedience. "I heard you've been asking questions about old times. Mind if I come in? We need to talk." Jake stepped aside to let his former mentor enter, his heart pounding as he realized that his investigation had somehow reached Brennan's ears. The older man walked into Jake's modest living room and took a seat without being invited, his movements deliberate and controlled. It was a power play that Jake recognized from their years working together. Brennan had always been a master at psychological manipulation. "Sarah Chung called me," Brennan said without preamble, his eyes fixed on Jake's face. "She said you found something out by Skeleton Ridge that's got you all stirred up. Care to tell me what this is really about?" Jake's mind raced. Sarah had promised to keep their conversation confidential while they investigated further, but apparently her loyalty to the former sheriff ran deeper than Jake had realized. Or perhaps Brennan had ways of extracting information that Jake didn't understand. Either way, Jake now knew he was on his own in this confrontation. "I found Miguel Santos," Jake said quietly, deciding that directness was his best strategy. "Oh, what's left of him?" "Along with handcuffs and your badge. Tom, the badge you supposedly lost during your last year in office." Brennan's expression didn't change, but Jake caught a slight tightening around his eyes, a tell that he remembered from the interrogation room. The former sheriff was calculating his response, weighing his options like a chess player considering his next move. "You always were too smart for your own good, Jake," Brennan said finally, his voice taking on a tone of regretful disappointment. "I hoped you'd have the sense to let sleeping dogs lie. That poor bastard Miguel has been dead for over 20 years. What good does digging him up do anybody now?" The casual admission hit Jake like a physical blow. He had hoped against hope that there might be another explanation, that somehow his mentor wasn't the killer that all evidence suggested. But Brennan's words removed any doubt about his guilt. "So you admit it?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You killed Miguel Santos?" Brennan stood up and walked to Jake's window, gazing out at the desert landscape as if considering how much truth to reveal. When he turned back, his expression was that of a teacher preparing to deliver a hard lesson to a naive student. "Miguel Santos was going to destroy everything we built in Dusty Creek," Brennan said calmly. "The businesses, the jobs, the prosperity that corruption investigation would have brought down. It wasn't just about a few bribes. Jake, It was about the survival of our entire community. Sometimes, a lawman has to make hard choices to serve the greater good. Jake felt sick listening to Brennan's rationalization. The man who had taught him about justice was calmly explaining how he had murdered an innocent witness to cover up corruption. But what made it even worse was the paternal tone Brennan was using, as if he expected Jake to understand and approve of his actions. Miguel had a family, Jake said, his anger beginning to override his shock. A wife and 2 kids. They spent 23 years wondering what happened to him, thinking he'd abandoned them. Collateral damage, Brennan replied with a slight shrug. I'm not proud of it, but I did what had to be done. The corruption investigation would have destroyed dozens of families, not just one. I made a calculation that saved our town. The cold pragmatism in Brennan's voice revealed the true nature of the man Jake had once idolized. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a crime of passion. It was the calculated murder of an innocent man by someone who believed he was above the law he had sworn to uphold. Jake realized that his entire law enforcement career had been built on a lie. Every lesson about justice and integrity that Brennan had taught him had been meaningless words from a man who was willing to commit murder when it served his purposes. The betrayal was so complete and devastating that Jake felt as if his entire sense of identity was crumbling. But as he looked into Brennan's cold eyes, Jake also felt something else stirring within him, a determination to ensure that Miguel Santos finally received the justice that had been denied to him for over 2 decades. The truth might destroy everything Jake had once believed, but it was still the truth, and it deserved to see the light of day. The grand jury hearing took place in an atmosphere of unprecedented security. Attorney General Valdez had taken Brennan's threat seriously, deploying federal marshals and FBI tactical teams throughout the region to search for Miguel's family while protecting Jake and other witnesses. The courtroom was sealed, with armed guards at every entrance and snipers positioned on nearby rooftops. Jake's testimony lasted for over 6 hours, during which he presented not only the physical evidence from the well site, but also Miguel's tape, recording, and the results of his investigation into the broader corruption network. The grand jury listened in stunned silence as the full scope of Brennan's crimes was revealed, understanding that they were dealing with not just a single murder, but a conspiracy that had corrupted an entire county for decades. But even as Jake testified, his thoughts remained focused on Elena Santos and her children. FBI agents were conducting a massive search operation, but Brennan had had decades to prepare hiding places and escape routes throughout the desert. The former sheriff's knowledge of the terrain and his network of loyal associates made him a formidable adversary, even for federal law enforcement. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Sarah Chun, the current sheriff who had mysteriously taken leave after Jake's initial visit, suddenly appeared at the courthouse with vital information about Brennan's location. She revealed that she had been working undercover for the FBI for months, investigating corruption in her own department that she suspected was connected to Brennan's old network. Sarah had tracked Brennan to an abandoned mining complex in the mountains east of Dusty Creek, a location where he had apparently been holding Miguel's family while planning his escape from the country. The mining complex was honeycombed with tunnels and had multiple exit points, making it an ideal fortress for someone trying to evade capture. FBI tactical teams surrounded the mining complex as Jake's testimony concluded, but Brennan was far from finished fighting. He had booby-trapped the tunnels and was prepared for a siege, using Miguel's family as human shields while he negotiated for safe passage out of the country. The standoff stretched through the night, with federal negotiators trying to find a peaceful resolution while tactical teams looked for ways to neutralize the threat without endangering the hostages. Jake couldn't bear to wait passively while Miguel's family remained in danger because of his decision to seek justice. Despite orders to remain under federal protection, he slipped away from his handlers and made his way to the mining complex, using his knowledge of the desert terrain to approach undetected. He was determined to confront Brennan one final time, to end the cycle of violence that had begun with Miguel's murder over 2 decades earlier. The final confrontation took place in the deepest tunnel of the abandoned mine, where Brennan had made his last stand. Jake found his former mentor holding Elena Santos at gunpoint, her adult children bound and gagged nearby. The years had finally caught up with Brennan. His silver hair was wild, his eyes held the desperate gleam of a cornered animal, and his once commanding presence had devolved into the paranoid rage of a man who knew his empire was crumbling. "I made you, Jake," Brennan snarled when he saw his former protege emerge from the shadows. "Everything you know about being a lawman, I taught you, and this is how you repay me." Jake kept his hands visible and his voice calm, knowing that Elena's life hung in the balance of the next few minutes. "You taught me about justice, Tom. Real justice. The kind that Miguel Santos deserved and never got. The kind that his family has been waiting for all these years." The conversation that followed was a final reckoning between mentor and student, between the corruption of power and the integrity of true justice. Brennan tried one last time to justify his actions, to convince Jake that murder and corruption had been necessary evils in service of a greater good. But Jake had moved beyond such rationalizations, understanding now that justice isn't about choosing between bad options. It is about having the courage to do what is right regardless of the consequences. When FBI agents finally breached the tunnel, they found Brennan in custody, his weapons surrendered, and Miguel's family safe. Jake had managed to talk his former mentor into giving up, appealing not to Brennan's non-existent conscience but to his pride, convincing him that dying in a shootout would be the act of a common criminal, while facing trial would allow him to maintain some dignity in defeat. The trials that followed revealed the full extent of the corruption network that had controlled Dusty Creek for decades. Dozens of officials and businessmen were indicted, and the systematic looting of public resources was exposed for all to see. Thomas Brennan was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to life in prison without parole, finally paying the price for crimes that had gone unpunished for far too long. But for Jake, the most meaningful moment came when he was able to attend Miguel Santos' proper burial standing beside Elena and her children as they finally said goodbye to the husband and father who had died trying to protect them. The small cemetery service was attended by dozens of people whose lives had been touched by Miguel's sacrifice. And Jake realized that justice isn't just about punishing the guilty. It is about honoring the innocent and ensuring that their sacrifices have meaning. As Jake returned to his ranch after the trials concluded, he found himself fundamentally changed by the experience. His faith in justice had been shattered and rebuilt, stronger than before, because it was now based on hard-won wisdom rather than naive idealism. He understood now that the badge represents not infallible authority, but the responsibility to serve truth and justice, even when doing so requires sacrificing everything else. The desert around his ranch looked the same as always, but Jake saw it differently now. The harsh landscape that had once seemed empty and unforgiving now appeared to him as a place where truth could survive even when buried for decades, where justice could eventually prevail even against overwhelming corruption. In the end, the desert had given up its secrets, and Miguel Santos had finally found the justice that had been denied to him for so long. Jake had learned that sometimes the most important battles aren't won quickly or easily, but they are won by those who refuse to give up on the truth, no matter how deeply it has been buried. Jake knew he needed concrete evidence that would be impossible for Brennan's network to suppress or discredit. The next morning, he returned to the abandoned well at Skeleton Ridge, this time bringing proper excavation tools and a camera to document everything he found. Working carefully to preserve the crime scene, he uncovered additional evidence that painted a horrifying picture of Miguel's final hours. Among the remains, Jake found fragments of rope that had been used to bind Miguel's hands and feet. The positioning of the bones suggested that Miguel had been thrown into the well while still alive. left to die slowly in the desert heat. Most damning of all was a small tape recorder that had somehow survived the decades buried in the sand, a device that Miguel had apparently been carrying when he was murdered. With trembling hands, Jake carefully cleaned the old recorder and was amazed to find that the cassette tape inside was still intact. When he played it back on his truck's stereo system, he heard Miguel Santos' voice from beyond the grave, recording his final conversation with Sheriff Brennan on the night he disappeared. The tape revealed that Miguel had been wearing a wire during his meeting with Brennan, having grown suspicious of the sheriff's true loyalties. The recording captured everything: Brennan's attempts to convince Miguel to flee town, his threats when Miguel refused, and finally the sound of his struggle as the sheriff decided that murder was his only option. But the tape contained even more damning evidence. In his final moments, believing he was about to die, Miguel had desperately whispered the names of other victims and the locations where evidence of the corruption network could be found. The recording provided a roadmap to exposing the entire criminal enterprise that had controlled Dusty Creek for decades. Armed with this evidence, Jake drove straight to the state capitol, bypassing local law enforcement entirely. He went directly to the office of the state attorney general, a woman named Patricia Valdez, who had built her reputation on fighting corruption in rural communities. Jake had followed her career in the newspapers and knew she was one of the few officials with both the authority and integrity to handle such a massive case. Valdez listened to the tape recording with growing amazement and horror. The evidence was so compelling and detailed that she immediately authorized a full investigation, bringing in FBI agents and forensic specialists who were outside of Brennan's sphere of influence. Within hours, search warrants were being prepared, and task forces were being assembled to investigate not just Miguel's murder, but the entire corruption network he had died trying to expose. But Jake's sense of satisfaction was short-lived. That evening, as he prepared to testify before the grand jury that Valdez was convening, he received a phone call that chilled him to the bone. The voice on the other end was calm and familiar. Thomas Brennan. "You've made a mistake, Jake," his former mentor said quietly. "A mistake that's going to cost you everything you care about. Did you really think you could outsmart me after all these years?" Before Jake could respond, Brennan continued with the cold efficiency of a predator explaining the rules to his prey. He had taken Elena Santos hostage, along with her adult children who had come to visit their mother. If Jake testified or provided any further evidence to the authorities, Miguel's family would suffer the same fate as Miguel himself. The cruel irony wasn't lost on Jake. In trying to get justice for Miguel Santos, he had potentially doomed the family that Miguel had died trying to protect. Brennan had once again demonstrated that he was always one step ahead, always calculating the most effective way to eliminate threats to his freedom. Jake realized that he was facing an impossible choice. He could testify and expose Brennan's crimes, knowing that innocent people would die as a result. Or he could remain silent, allowing a serial killer to escape justice and ensuring that Miguel Santos' sacrifice had been meaningless. Either way, people would suffer because of decisions that Jake made. But as he weighed his options, Jake remembered something that Miguel had said on the tape recording. Even facing death, Miguel had refused to be intimidated by Brennan's threats against his family. He had chosen to do the right thing regardless of the personal cost, trusting that eventually the truth would prevail and his sacrifice would have meaning. Jake realized that he was being called upon to show the same courage that Miguel Santos had demonstrated in his final moments. The path forward wasn't about choosing between bad options. It was about having faith that justice would ultimately prevail, even when the immediate consequences seemed unbearable. Standing in his kitchen with the phone still in his hand, Jake made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He would testify before the grand jury and provide all the evidence he had gathered, trusting that law enforcement would be able to rescue Miguel's family before Brennan could carry out his threats. It was a leap of faith that terrified him, but it was also the only choice that honored the memory of Miguel Santos and all the other victims of Brennan's crimes. As Jake hung up the phone and prepared for what might be his final confrontation with the man who had once been his hero, he felt a strange sense of peace settling over him. For the first time in 23 years, he was fully embracing his role as a guardian of justice, ready to pay whatever price was necessary to ensure that the truth finally prevailed. The confrontation with Brennan left Jake shaken to his core, but it also crystallized his resolve to expose the truth about Miguel Santos' murder. However, he quickly discovered that seeking justice after 23 years would be far more complicated than he had imagined. When he tried to contact Sarah Chun the following morning, he learned that she had taken an unexpected leave of absence, and her deputy couldn't provide any information about when she might return. Jake's attempts to reach the FBI or state authorities were met with bureaucratic obstacles and requests for evidence that he couldn't provide, without risking the contamination of the crime scene. Moreover, he began to suspect that Brennan's influence in the region extended far beyond what he had previously understood. The former sheriff had spent decades building relationships throughout law enforcement and local government, relationships that might now be working to protect him. Feeling increasingly isolated, Jake decided to conduct his own investigation into the extent of the corruption that Miguel Santos had been prepared to expose. He spent hours in the public library, poring over old newspaper archives and public records from 2001. What he discovered painted a picture of systematic corruption that went far deeper than a few simple bribes. The businesses that Miguel had been prepared to testify against weren't just paying for favorable treatment from local officials. They were part of a complex network that controlled everything from zoning decisions to law enforcement priorities. Construction contracts, business licenses, even judicial appointments seemed to flow through a small group of influential men who had turned Dusty Creek into their personal fiefdom. At the center of this web of corruption was Thomas Brennan, who had used his position as sheriff to protect the network and eliminate threats to their operations. Miguel Santos hadn't just been a witness to isolated criminal acts. He had been prepared to expose an entire system of organized corruption that had enriched a few at the expense of the many. Jake also discovered that Miguel's family had never stopped looking for answers about his disappearance. His widow, Elena Santos, still lived in a neighboring county, and his children had grown up never knowing what had happened to their father. The newspaper archives contained several heartbreaking articles about the family's efforts to find Miguel, including rewards they had offered and private investigators they had hired. The knowledge that Miguel's family had suffered for over 2 decades while his killer lived as a respected member of the community filled Jake with a rage that burned deeper than anything he had ever felt. But it also strengthened his determination to ensure that the truth finally came to light, regardless of the personal cost. Jake's investigation also revealed disturbing information about his own past. Looking back through the records, he found evidence that several cases he had worked on as a deputy had been quietly dismissed or had disappeared from the court dockets without explanation. Witnesses had changed their testimony, evidence had gone missing, and prosecutors had suddenly lost interest in pursuing charges against certain individuals. The realization that he had unknowingly been part of Brennan's corrupt system was devastating. Jake had always prided himself on his integrity, but now he understood that his mentor had been using him as an unwitting tool to legitimize criminal activities. Every arrest Jake had made, every case he had built, had been filtered through Brennan's corrupt priorities. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the growing certainty that Miguel Santos had not been Brennan's only victim. The systematic nature of the corruption network suggested that other obstacles to their operations had likely been eliminated as well. Jake began to research other unexplained disappearances and suspicious deaths in the region during Brennan's tenure as sheriff. and what he found made his blood run cold. At least 3 other potential witnesses or investigators had died under suspicious circumstances during the years when Brennan had been building his corrupt empire. A federal auditor had suffered a fatal car accident while investigating county finances. A journalist researching local corruption had apparently committed suicide just days before publishing a major expose. A businessman who had refused to participate in the corruption network had died in what was ruled a home invasion robbery, though nothing had actually been stolen. The pattern was clear to Jake, even if he couldn't prove it in court. Thomas Brennan hadn't just been a corrupt sheriff. He had been a serial killer who had eliminated anyone who threatened his criminal empire. The badge that Jake had found at the well wasn't just evidence of Miguel's murder. It was a trophy from a man who had perverted everything that the badge was supposed to represent. Jake realized that he was likely in serious danger. Brennan now knew that his crimes had been discovered, and based on his history, the former sheriff wouldn't hesitate to eliminate another threat to his freedom. But Jake also knew that he might be the only person in a position to ensure that Miguel Santos and the other victims finally received justice. As he sat in his ranch house that evening, cleaning his grandfather's old revolver and checking the locks on his doors, Jake made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. If the system wouldn't provide justice for Miguel Santos and the other victims, then Jake would have to find another way to ensure that the truth came to light and that Thomas Brennan finally paid for his crimes.